Tievecrum townland, South Armagh, the night of 15th April 1976. The house sits on low ground less than 50 metres inside Northern Ireland, close enough to the Republic that a man could cross the border in minutes on foot. From covert observation positions established in the surrounding fields, a team from D Squadron, 22 SAS, holds still in the dark. They have been out here for days. They haven't moved much. They haven't been seen. Their target is inside. He is 25 years old. He grew up in Belleeks, a few miles south. He works as a scrap metal dealer. Within the Provisional IRA's 1st Battalion, South Armagh Brigade, he holds the rank of Staff Officer and additionally serves as the unit's treasurer. Two distinct functional roles in the operational administrative layer of one of the most lethal guerrilla units in the world. He has been living on the run in the Republic for months. He slipped back secretly to visit his pregnant girlfriend. They were supposed to be married in a fortnight. His name was Peter Cleary. The men watching from the field had not been sent merely to detain him. Before the Loughgall ambush of 1987, before the East Tyrone Brigade was dismantled in a single evening, and before 14 intelligence company had assembled the intelligence picture that made every senior IRA man in the South Armagh border corridor a potential target, the shadow war in Bandit country had a beginning. This was it. One house, one night, one staff officer who died in a field near the border, and a methodology that would run forward for 11 years. There is a correction this story requires up front, because a script claiming to set the historical record straight can't sidestep it. The killing described here happened on 15th April 1976, not 1975. The Forkhill 1975 framing that appears across various accounts derives from confusion with a real and separate catastrophe. On 17th July 1975, the South Armagh Brigade detonated a bomb concealed inside a beer keg at Cortresla Bridge, Tullydonnell, near Forkhill. 4 British soldiers were killed: Major Peter Willis, aged 37, Edward Garside, 34, Robert McCarter, 33, and Calvert Brown, 25. Described at the time as the first major breach of that year's ceasefire, the beer keg bombing was a Forkhill event and a 1975 event. It isn't the Peter Cleary killing. The year of Cleary's death is 1976. That matters because precision about dates is the minimum standard for any account presenting itself as a historical correction. The story begins in 1975. The killing is 1976. To understand what D Squadron was sent to do and why the British government had concluded that standard infantry operations were failing, start with the operational record of South Armagh between 1971 and 1976. The numbers aren't abstractions. Between 1970 and 1997, the South Armagh Brigade of the Provisional IRA killed at least 165 members of British security forces. No other IRA brigade in Northern Ireland came close to that rate of sustained attrition. South Armagh covers approximately 440 square miles of border country, predominantly Catholic, with Republican traditions running back through the War of Independence and earlier. Forkhill sits roughly 5 miles from Dundalk in the Republic of Ireland. The border in this part of Armagh isn't marked in any visible way that matters operationally. It's a hedgerow, a farm track, a drainage channel that crosses jurisdictions without ceremony. An IRA active service unit could carry out an attack in South Armagh and be across the border within minutes. The brigade exploited its geography with deliberation. By the early 1970s, IRA engineers in the area had developed the culvert bomb, an improvised explosive device packed into a drainage pipe beneath a country road, detonated remotely when an army vehicle passed overhead. In August 1972, a landmine destroyed an armoured vehicle near Crossmaglen, killing one soldier. By October 1975, after another armoured vehicle was blown up near Crossmaglen, the British Army made the most operationally significant concession of the entire South Armagh campaign. It surrendered the roads. From that point, virtually all troop movements and resupply runs were conducted by helicopter. The skies weren't safe either. A 1976 ITN News at 10 broadcast, narrated by Peter Snow, stated plainly that Army helicopters must approach low for fear of being shot at. The broadcast described this territory as the Bandit country of Northern Ireland, the IRA heartland, some of the best country for guerrilla tactics anywhere in the world. The South Armagh Brigade would eventually shoot down 5 British Army helicopters over the course of the Troubles. By 1994, the only safe way for British forces to move across the area was aboard Chinook troop carriers. What made South Armagh categorically different from every other IRA operational zone in Northern Ireland was the combination of terrain, community, and organisational resilience. The brigade retained its traditional battalion structure, 1 battalion around Jonesborough, 1 around Crossmaglen, and refused to adopt the cellular reorganisation the rest of the provisional movement was forced into after intelligence failures elsewhere. In South Armagh's close-knit rural communities, where IRA membership frequently ran through families across generations, infiltration was enormously difficult. The community also provided an early warning network that no British surveillance system could match at the time. That 1976 ITN report noted that knowledge of army patrol movements passed from mouth to mouth through the local population. A foot patrol moving through South Armagh had often been observed, relayed, and anticipated before it reached its destination. Merlin Rees, Labour's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, gave this environment its defining name. Most sources credit him with the phrase "Bandit country" in January 1976, in direct response to the sectarian massacres of that period. One academic source places the coinage as early as 1974, and there is a reasonable argument that the phrase was circulating in military circles before Rees made it official. But what is documented is that the media adopted it immediately in January 1976 and never let it go. An SAS veteran, writing under the title Eye of the Storm, confirmed it from personal experience. "We called South Armagh Bandit country because there were few places British soldiers could walk or army vehicles drive without the very real danger of being taken out." The regiments deployed to South Armagh in 1974 and 1975, the Royal Green Jackets, the Parachute Regiment, the locally recruited Ulster Defence Regiment, understood the ground well enough to know they didn't control it. They patrolled by helicopter. They operated from fortified bases. They took casualties. What they couldn't alter was the fundamental operational dynamic. The South Armagh Brigade set the tempo, the British Army reacted, and the border remained IRA territory in all but the most technical legal sense. Into this environment, in early 1975, the British government introduced a ceasefire. On the 9th of February 1975, the Provisional IRA declared a formal truce with the British government, following back-channel negotiations conducted over the preceding weeks. Incident centres, partly staffed by Sinn Féin representatives, were established across Northern Ireland to monitor compliance. For most of the provisional movement, it represented a genuine political opening, an early signal of the internal debate that would eventually produce the long war strategy, the cellular restructuring of 1977, and much further down the line, the peace process itself. The South Armagh Brigade treated it as something that applied to other people. Violence in the border corridor continued throughout 1975. 4 soldiers died in the beer keg bombing near Forkhill in July. In September, 5 Orangemen were killed when a unit operating as the South Armagh Republican Action Force attacked an Orange lodge in Newtown, Hamilton. That same ITN broadcast from 1976 stated flatly that 9 soldiers had been killed in South Armagh in the past year, during what it called a year-old ceasefire. 9 soldiers, during a nominal truce. The South Armagh Brigade's compliance with the ceasefire was, according to one academic study, essentially zero. The ceasefire formally ended on the 23rd of January 1976. 18 days earlier, it had been effectively destroyed. On the 4th of January 1976, the Ulster Volunteer Force murdered 3 brothers from the Reevy family and 3 members of the O'Dowd family in coordinated loyalist attacks. 6 Catholic civilians killed in a single night. The following evening, 5th of January, the South Armagh Republican Action Force stopped a workers' minibus near Bessbrook on the Kingsmill Road. The gunmen demanded that each passenger state his religion. They found 1 Catholic in the group and told him to step aside. Then they lined up the other 10 Protestant workmen and shot them dead. 10 men, on a country road in County Armagh. Harold Wilson couldn't absorb Kingsmill without a public response. On the 7th of January 1976, 2 days after the massacre, he announced that the Special Air Service would be deployed to Northern Ireland. The formal parliamentary debate followed in the House of Commons on the 12th of January. Ostensibly, the SAS was being sent to South Armagh for reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. That framing was accurate in the narrowest technical sense and misleading in every operationally meaningful one. The SAS wasn't starting from zero in Northern Ireland in January 1976, and the audience for this history deserves to have that stated plainly. Prior to Wilson's announcement, SAS-connected personnel had been present in the province, operating through the 14th Intelligence Company and their subunit 4 Field Survey Troop. Administrative records listed individuals as 22 SAS from at least mid-1975. What changed in January 1976 wasn't whether SAS soldiers were in Northern Ireland, but the scale, the official acknowledgement, and the operational mandate. Covert individual placements within intelligence-gathering structures were replaced by a full squadron deployment with an explicit counter-insurgency role in a defined area. Mark Urban's Big Boys Rules, which explicitly covers the period 1976 to 87 as a unified SAS campaign, opens its operational timeline at the Cleary killing. Urban is precise about the initial scale, 12 men. The unit was D Squadron, 22 SAS. Toby Harnden's Bandit Country, the most authoritative journalistic account of the South Armagh campaign, built from extensive interviews with serving and retired security force personnel and drawing on inquest records, describes the commanding officer in this period as commanding officer of the SAS's D Squadron, which had arrived in South Armagh 6 weeks earlier. Counting back from the 15th of April 1976, that places D Squadron's arrival in the border area at approximately early March 1976. Harold Wilson resigned on the 16th of March 1976, 5 weeks before the Cleary operation. James Callaghan succeeded him. D Squadron was already operational. The intelligence work was already underway. What the SAS brought was the capacity to act first, to identify a target, establish covert surveillance, and intervene before the IRA knew an operation was running. That change in posture is what the Cleary killing illustrates. The brigade hadn't triggered a response. D Squadron had gone looking. Peter Joseph Cleary was born on the 18th of September 1950, the second eldest of 13 children born to Hugh and Mary Cleary. He grew up in Magee Terrace, Belleeks, in the townlands south of Crossmaglen, the heartland of the South Armagh Brigade. He made his living as a scrap metal dealer. At some point after the Troubles broke out in 1968, he joined the 1st Battalion of the South Armagh Brigade of the Provisional IRA. He was elected or appointed as the unit's treasurer and held the operational rank of Staff Officer. In the command structure of the Provisional IRA's South Armagh Brigade in this period, a staff officer was a mid to senior position in the operational administrative tier. The brigade ran 2 battalions, the first around Jonesborough, the second around Crossmaglen, each with its own command staff. A staff officer in this structure wasn't a frontline triggerman on a specific active service unit. He was an organiser, a planner, a coordinator of people and resources. Tony Geraghty's The Irish War describes him as a top PIRA killer. Phil Miller's Keeny Meeny identifies him as an IRA staff officer. Multiple sources confirm both the designation and his position in the 1st Battalion command structure. By 1976, Peter Cleary was on British intelligence's list of wanted men. He was also on the run. By early 1976, Cleary was living in the Republic of Ireland, out of reach of direct British Army action and of the RUC. South Armagh IRA members did this routinely: cross the border, base themselves in the Republic, conduct operations when circumstances allowed, return to sanctuary. The Republic provided not just physical distance from British jurisdiction, but a political complication. Any British military action that strayed across the border, even in pursuit of a wanted man, risked a diplomatic incident of serious proportions. The IRA understood this leverage and used it. What brought Cleary back across the border on the night of 15th April 1976 was personal, not operational. His girlfriend was pregnant. The wedding was 2 weeks away. He crossed into Northern Ireland to see her. It was, by any tactical assessment, a vulnerability, a predictable return to a known location, a place British intelligence could watch. 10 days earlier, on 5th April 1976, UDR Corporal Robert McConnell had been shot dead in the garden of his home at Tullyvallen, near Newtown Hamilton. Journalist Joe Tiernan, writing in The Dublin Bombings and the Murder Triangle, names Cleary as the triggerman, alleging that he was part of a 3-man IRA unit that ambushed McConnell as he appeared at his own front door. That is a single journalist attribution, not corroborated in official records. What is documented is the 10-day sequence. McConnell killed on 5th April. Cleary killed on 15th April. Whether British intelligence's awareness of Cleary was accelerated by the McConnell killing isn't established in the available record. What is established is that by the time Cleary crossed back into Northern Ireland, D Squadron knew which house he would go to and had already been watching it. The surveillance began at least 3 days before the night of 15th April, possibly longer. The Wikipedia account of Cleary, drawing on Tony Geraghty's The Irish War, states the house had been under observation for about a week from observation positions. Another account, drawn from the book Undercover War, places the covert operation at 3 days before the interception. Both timelines are consistent with the operational picture. The SAS had established concealed observation posts in the fields surrounding the house at Tievecrum, less than a mile north of the border, and were monitoring it before Cleary arrived. They were waiting. Tievecrum is a townland, not a village. It has no centre, no main street, no landmark visible from a distance. It's the kind of terrain the South Armagh Brigade had spent years using. Low hedgerows, wet fields, gentle rises and gullies that offered natural cover. The border was 50 metres to the south. In practice, for a man who knew the ground, that distance was irrelevant to movement. Cleary crossed into Northern Ireland at some point on 15th April and went to his girlfriend's house. The D Squadron surveillance team identified him. At a point that night, the team moved in. The arrest was quick. Cleary gave a false name when challenged. He was recognised regardless. The SAS took him from the house and away from the other occupants. He was searched. He was moved into a field to await helicopter extraction from Bessbrook Mill, the primary British Army helicopter base for South Armagh operations, located approximately 8 miles north. Road transport for a high-value prisoner in South Armagh in 1976 wasn't a viable option. The roads belonged to the brigade. While 4 members of the SAS team spread out in the field and used lanterns to guide the inbound helicopter to a landing in the darkness, a young officer remained with Cleary as his guard. According to statements given at the subsequent inquest, this officer was on his first SAS operation. What happened next is the centre of a dispute that was never formally resolved. The inquest returned an open verdict approximately 9 months after the killing. Neither lawful killing nor unlawful killing was found. That result is the single most important legal fact about Peter Cleary's death. The official process couldn't determine the exact circumstances. Here is what the official account says. The SAS officer, who gave evidence at inquest only as Soldier A, his identity withheld, stated that Cleary, despite being in custody and awaiting extraction, made a sudden lurch at him and attempted to seize his rifle. The officer's prepared statement, read at the inquest, cast Cleary as physically formidable and framed the situation as a life-threatening struggle. Soldier A went on. As he lurched at me, my instincts as an SAS soldier took over. I released the safety catch on my weapon and started shooting. Cleary was hit twice. He didn't die immediately. An NCO then took the rifle from Soldier A and fired a third shot, which was described as being fired to end his misery. Before returning the weapon to the young officer, the NCO wiped his own fingerprints from it. 3 shots, 2 fired by the officer, 1 by the NCO, whose prints were then deliberately removed from the weapon. Cleary received 3 wounds to the chest. Here is what the Republican account says. A witness who had been inside the house, one of the occupants present when the SAS entered, gave testimony at the inquest. Shortly after the soldiers had taken Cleary away, this witness heard, from inside the house, somebody crying over a ditch, followed by a single shot. A single shot. Not a burst of fire from a desperate struggle. 1 shot, following the sound of crying. Republican sources, including multiple commemorative accounts and the family's own statements, describe Cleary as an unarmed prisoner who was stripped, searched, and executed. An account gathered from sources described as witnesses in a later summary states he was subjected to physical assault before being shot. The Republican framing has been consistent since 1976. Shot dead whilst unarmed and a prisoner by SAS at Forkhill. His mother, Mary Cleary, filed legal action against British military authorities around 2014. Nearly 40 years after her son's death, seeking accountability for what the family maintained was an unlawful killing. The Cork Examiner, writing from the Republic of Ireland 2 days after the shooting, described it on 17th of April 1976 as an act of utter folly. Phil Miller, writing in Keeny Meeny, noted the physical implausibility at the heart of the official narrative. It's hard to understand how Cleary assaulted the guard from 4 feet away. That observation matters because it comes from a British published account that isn't drawing on Republican sources. The escape attempt narrative required Cleary to have rushed a trained SAS soldier from close range, in the dark, while the soldier's colleagues were within a short distance, guiding in a helicopter. The spatial and situational logic of that account has never been fully explained. Mike Ryan's Secret Operations of the SAS offers a third version entirely, that Cleary actually escaped custody and was shot by pursuing soldiers as he attempted to reach the border. That account isn't corroborated by other sources and isn't consistent with the inquest testimony. What the evidence establishes with certainty: Cleary was arrested, taken to a field, and shot 3 times. He died from those wounds. No weapon was recovered from his body. The NCO who fired the 3rd shot cleaned his fingerprints from the rifle. The inquest jury couldn't determine the lawful or unlawful nature of the killing. The case returned an open verdict. It has never been closed. Soldier A's statement, with its self-identification, "My instincts as an SAS soldier took over," was notable in one specific respect. He named himself, in open inquest testimony, as an SAS soldier, at a time when the British government was still officially describing the regiment's role in Northern Ireland as primarily reconnaissance. The statement was made in a coroner's court, under testimony conditions. It didn't make the front pages, but it placed the SAS's identity, operational presence, and use of lethal force in the public record in a way that diplomatic language could no longer obscure. 3 SAS members attended the inquest. The regiment didn't deny involvement. The open verdict was the legal system's acknowledgement that the truth of what happened in that field near Forkhill wasn't recoverable from the evidence available. It remains that way. 20 days after Peter Cleary was shot, on 5 May 1976, 8 SAS members were arrested by the Garda Síochána in County Louth in the Republic of Ireland. They were found in 3 cars, carrying submachine guns, handguns, a sawn-off shotgun, and a dagger. The British government's reaction to the arrests, documented in confidential files released under the 30-year rule and covered by Anne Foblacht, was extreme. London threatened dire consequences and prepared a range of retaliatory options, including sanctions, a ban on remittances to Irish citizens in Britain, and the withdrawal of Irish citizen voting rights if the men were jailed. The 8 were eventually released with a fine. The Irish government, the document showed, had been quietly cooperative throughout. In Dundalk, during the questioning following the arrests, the SAS men were asked about killings in the border area, including the death of Peter Cleary. The proximity of that incident to the Cleary operation, 20 days, the same border corridor, the same unit, wasn't coincidental. D Squadron was operating across and near the border throughout this period. The Cleary killing and the Louth arrests together represented the opening weeks of an intelligence and special operations campaign that the British government had publicly announced in January, but was now conducting with an intensity that alarmed Dublin and the Irish political establishment in equal measure. The diplomatic cost was real. The operational course wasn't changed. The IRA's South Armagh Brigade absorbed the news of Cleary's death with an immediate operational consequence. The book Undercover War records it directly. Many senior members of the unit, believing Cleary had been executed and that the SAS intended to kill them all in cold blood, retreated across the border. Not a tactical withdrawal, a flight. The most senior operational figures in the South Armagh Brigade crossed into the Republic because they believed the SAS was running a kill list, not a detention operation, and they were on it. The same source records a broader observation from an unspecified British assessment, that for approximately 5 months following the SAS deployment in South Armagh, a marked reduction in IRA activity was observed in the area. That figure is a security force assessment, not an independent analysis, and should be read as such. But the withdrawal of senior brigade figures across the border is documented and consistent with the observable fact that no major brigade operation was mounted in the weeks immediately following Cleary's death. Republican commemorations of Cleary began almost immediately. By 1977, annual services were being held at his grave. His killing had been absorbed into Republican iconography as a martyrdom, not a tactical loss, but evidence of a British policy of extrajudicial execution. That framing served the IRA's propaganda requirements while simultaneously reflecting a genuine operational reality. The South Armagh Brigade now faced an adversary that didn't follow the predictable patterns of regular army deployment. They didn't know when the SAS would move or who was already under surveillance. That uncertainty was itself an intelligence product, and D Squadron had created it by doing one thing well on one night in April 1976. In 1977, the SAS killed Seamus Harvey in a separate South Armagh operation. Mark Urban, in Big Boys Rules, groups Harvey and Cleary together as part of a series of SAS operations in 1976 and 1977. Then, for roughly 5 years, from late 1978 to late 1983, no IRA member was killed by the SAS in South Armagh. The regiment's focus shifted. The methodology, however, was being refined. Between 1976 and 1987, D Squadron and subsequent SAS rotations in Northern Ireland were developing 2 capacities simultaneously. The first was technical, improving the intelligence-gathering infrastructure that allowed them to identify targets, establish pattern-of-life profiles, and move against those targets at the moment of maximum advantage. The 14th Intelligence Company, the DET, as operators called it, expanded in this period, running deep surveillance operations in South Armagh and East Tyrone that accumulated intelligence on IRA personnel and movement over years, not weeks. Academic analysis of the period notes that by the mid-1970s, an SAS squadron of up to 65 soldiers was operating in South Armagh, a substantial scaling up from the initial 12 men Wilson had announced in January 1976. The second capacity was doctrinal, the understanding that intelligence-led interception, the technique demonstrated at Tievecrum in April 1976, was the tool that could achieve what 22,000 infantry troops at the peak of 1972 deployment couldn't. The South Armagh Brigade's community base and border access made it essentially immune to conventional military pressure. It wasn't immune to a team of men who had been watching a specific house for a week before any weapon was drawn. By the mid-1980s, the methodology had spread from South Armagh to East Tyrone. The East Tyrone Brigade differed from the South Armagh unit in temperament and operational style. South Armagh's brigade was patient, elusive, meticulous. It had survived by being impossible to find. East Tyrone was bolder, more willing to mount large-scale assaults on fortified targets, RUC stations, barracks, military checkpoints. Those assaults required more men and more material in the open for longer periods. They were operationally impressive. They were also, eventually, readable. On the 8th May 1987, the East Tyrone Brigade mounted an operation against the RUC station in the village of Loughgall, County Armagh. 8 IRA volunteers drove to the station in a Toyota van, led by a JCB digger whose bucket contained a 500-pound bomb. Their plan was to blow the station and withdraw. The SAS, operating under the codename Operation Judy, was already waiting. They had been there before the IRA arrived. The ambush killed all 8 IRA members. A 9th victim, a civilian named Anthony Hughes, who happened to be driving past in a similar coloured van, was also shot dead by soldiers. A tragedy of misidentification in the darkness and the chaos that followed the initial contact. 8 IRA volunteers dead. The entire East Tyrone Active Service Unit wiped out in a single engagement. It remains the largest loss of life suffered by the Provisional IRA in a single operation. The intelligence that made Loughgall possible had not appeared overnight. It was the product of years of accumulated pattern-of-life surveillance, informant cultivation, and the operational template that the SAS had refined since the mid-1970s. An approach whose originating data point, whose opening case study, whose first demonstrated proof of concept was a field near the border in Tievecrum on the night of 15th April 1976. The question the title of this story poses is whether Peter Cleary was the first IRA man the SAS took down. The qualified answer is yes, with the qualifications specified. He was the first person killed by the SAS in Northern Ireland, following the official acknowledgement of their deployment in January 1976. SAS-connected personnel had been present in the province before that date in covert configurations. The record does not rule out earlier lethal contacts involving individuals administratively listed under SAS structures. What D Squadron demonstrated at Tievecrum was the first recorded instance of the post-announcement intelligence-led interception model. Surveillance, target identification, direct action that would define SAS operations in Northern Ireland for the following decade. The inquest returned an open verdict. The circumstances of Cleary's death were never formally adjudicated. The official account asks the listener to accept that a 25-year-old staff officer in custody, waiting for a helicopter with trained soldiers nearby, chose to lunge for a rifle from 4 feet away. The Republican account asks the listener to accept that the SAS methodically executed a prisoner and constructed an escape narrative afterward. The fingerprint wiping on the rifle is documented. The single witness who heard crying, then a shot, is documented. The open verdict is documented. History hasn't resolved the gap between those two accounts, and this script won't pretend to close it where a 9-month inquest couldn't. What isn't in dispute? The SAS came to South Armagh with a different mandate than the regiments that preceded them. The Cork Examiner's description of Cleary's death, an act of utter folly, reflected one reaction to the operation from across the border within 48 hours. The IRA's senior leadership fleeing into the Republic because they believed the SAS was executing its way through a list reflected another. Both reactions told the same underlying story. Something had changed in South Armagh. The operational environment that the IRA had controlled through a combination of terrain, community, and the predictability of regular army behaviour had been altered by the introduction of men who were prepared to lie still in a wet field for days, and who weren't bound by the conventions of military visibility. Peter Cleary was 25 years old, 2 weeks from his wedding, when he crossed back into Northern Ireland. He was a staff officer in one of the deadliest paramilitary units in the world, and he was on a British intelligence target list. Both of those things were true simultaneously. His death didn't resolve the question of what the SAS intended. The inquest ensured that. But it answered a different question for every senior IRA man in South Armagh who heard about it. The Shadow War had started. The old rules were gone. 11 years later, at Loughgall, 8 IRA volunteers arrived at an RUC station with a bomb in a digger bucket and found 100 SAS soldiers waiting for them. The methodology that made that ambush possible, intelligence-led, surveillance-based, proactive interception at a known target, wasn't invented in 1987. It was demonstrated for the first time in a field near Forkhill in the spring of 1976 by a D Squadron team that had been lying in the dark long enough to know exactly which house Peter Cleary would go to and exactly how long it would take for a helicopter to come from Bessbrook. If you want to understand how the SAS changed the war in Northern Ireland, start here. Not Loughgall, Tievecrum, 15th April 1976. Subscribe for more stories like this.